Over more than 6 decades dedicated to music, Paul McCartney has shaped an entire era. However, behind the friendly smile and polished public persona, this legend harbors a blacklist of bands he absolutely cannot stand. From those who shamelessly copied the Beatles for profit to chaotic groups with reckless lifestyles to even talented rivals who kept him awake at night with their brilliance, all have earned a place on Paul's list. So, which names made it into Paul McCartney's crosshairs of contempt? Let's dive in. Especially the story of the final band will reveal a tense and competitive underbelly that the music industry always tries to conceal. 1. Oasis profiteers of a stolen legacy. Paul McCartney has encountered countless imitators throughout his legendary career. None have angered and disgusted him quite like Oasis. In the 1990s, as Britpop swept through England, brothers Noel and Liam Gallagher rose as brash, noisy figures who openly declared themselves the heirs of the Beatles. Not only did they mimic the music, but they also copied gestures, walks, hairstyles, and even McCartney's signature gaze. In photo shoots, Oasis deliberately recreated iconic Beatles images from the Abbey Road crossing to the band's slanted poses. To the public, it was homage. To Paul McCartney, it was an insult. Noel Gallagher once told NME without the Beatles, there'd be no Oasis. A statement that seemed flattering, but to McCartney, it was just a cheap PR stunt. He knew better than anyone in showbiz no one admires you sincerely if they can ruthlessly profit off your name. At first, Paul maintained his courteous demeanor, diplomatically saying in interviews, "Oasis is a band with good energy. I like their spirit." But behind the scenes, he reportedly gritted his teeth when hearing their borrowed songs. A close friend recounted Paul laughed, but not in a friendly way. He said, "They think copying chords is creative." However, what truly enraged Paul McCartney wasn't Oasis's music, it was the Gallagher brothers' attitude of assuming they were the rightful heirs to the Beatles' legacy. They didn't just admire the Beatles, they acted as if they were inheriting a throne. Noel once brazenly declared to the press, "We're the Lennon and McCartney of the modern era." The insult didn't stop there, it came from Liam Gallagher too. He mocked Paul on stage, mimicking his Hey Jude vocals before yelling into the mic, "Thanks Paul McCartney for paving the road for us. Now step aside, old man." Those words were like a slap in Paul's face. He had spent his youth with John Lennon crafting songs that changed music history. Yet now, an upstart Britpop band arrogantly claimed to be their legitimate successors. He was so furious that he once tore up an Oasis interview in seconds. Paul never forgot that moment. At a 1997 London artists' gathering when Oasis entered, he quietly left the table, avoiding any confrontation. To him, Oasis was a soulless copy of a dream they could never understand. For Paul McCartney, nothing was more offensive than someone exploiting the legacy he had poured sweat and heart into for profit. Years later, when Noel Gallagher tried to make amends, sending deep admiration to McCartney, Paul responded curtly, "I hope they find their own voice, instead of borrowing someone else's." A gentle statement, but sharp enough to bury Oasis's delusion of standing shoulder to shoulder with the Beatles. If Oasis disgusted Paul McCartney with their arrogance and fakery, the next band made him shudder for a different reason. 2. The Beach Boys, a talent that haunted him. If the Rolling Stones annoyed Paul McCartney with their debauchery, the Beach Boys kept him up at night for another reason: they were too good. Initially, Paul admired them deeply, praising God only knows as the most perfect song ever written. But beneath that praise lay an obsession, almost jealousy. In 1966, when Pet Sounds was released, it turned the music world upside down. Its delicate melodies, intricate layered harmonies, and emotionally charged lyrics left Paul stunned. He listened to it repeatedly, dissecting every drum beat, vocal layer, and bass note. According to George Martin, Paul played Pet Sounds dozens of times in the studio. He was obsessed, and it gave birth to Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. But from admiration, Paul began to feel threatened. When Brian Wilson, the genius behind the Beach Boys, began working on his next project, Smile McCartney started to sweat. He closely followed every demo, every rumor in the production world, constantly wondering what's he doing next, and firmly declaring, "If he surpasses Pepper, I'll never forgive myself." But fate played a cruel twist. Smile stalled due to Brian Wilson's mental breakdown, and Paul's reaction wasn't sympathy, but cold criticism. If you can't finish what you start, you shouldn't be in this business. We, the Beatles, never gave up. The tension peaked at a fateful dinner at Brian Wilson's home in 1967. McCartney, slightly drunk, made a snide remark as the victor, "Your music's beautiful, but if you keep repeating yourself, you won't go far." Brian fell silent. Some recounted that after that night, Brian was so distressed he didn't leave his house for days. From then on, Paul maintained a strange distance. In public, he offered polite praise. "They have lovely harmonies," but he always followed with a jab. "But I think people overestimate their influence." The Beatles were on the right track. Even when speaking about God Only Knows, he prefaced perfect for American pop at the time. Music historian David Leaf once noted, Paul respected Brian Wilson, but would never admit that Brian pushed him to his peak, because doing so would mean admitting the Beatles weren't the only pinnacle. And that was what pained Paul most. The Beach Boys weren't a band he hated. They were the ones who forced him to confront himself. Years later, when Brian Wilson performed God Only Knows, Paul McCartney was in the audience, eyes welling up. He stood and clapped, smiling, but those red eyes said it all. He wasn't just applauding Brian Wilson, but the obsession that had haunted him his entire life. After all, it seemed nothing in the music world could rile Paul McCartney further, yet he was wrong. If the Beach Boys made him brood in silence this time, it wasn't jealousy or disappointment, but pure contempt for another band. 3. The Rolling Stones. Madmen only good for stunts. For half a century, fans believed the Beatles and the Rolling Stones were friendly rivals, often shaking hands for the cameras. But behind those smiles, Paul McCartney never truly saw the Stones as equals. While the Beatles spent their lives perfecting melodies, Mick Jagger and Keith Richards made music amid the stench of liquor, drugs, and the cackling laughter of girls around them. Paul thought, "When the Beatles recorded, we argued over chord structures. When the Stones recorded, they argued over which girl slept with whom." Paul knew this and despised it. His contempt wasn't just for their music, but for the lifestyle the Stones championed, partying, flaunting, and treating women like props. While the Beatles strove for elegance, the Stones turned themselves into symbols of hedonism. Mick Jagger bragged about romantic conquests, Keith Richards appeared strung out, and their concerts resembled orgiastic rituals more than musical performances. But think it stopped there. No, you're gravely mistaken. By 1968, when the Rolling Stones released their Satanic Majesty's Request, a psychedelic album, Paul noticed its eerie similarity to Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. According to the crew, McCartney was so furious, he threw a copy of the album to the floor and shouted a bunch of filthy magpies. His hatred was so intense that in a 2021 interview, McCartney couldn't restrain himself, nearly causing a scene. The Stones are just a blues cover band. Mick Jagger fired back on stage. The Beatles were just 4 guys and a drummer. He was referring to Ringo Starr, often seen as the Beatles' weak link. For years, Jagger needled Ringo to jab at the whole band. In a 1975 interview, when asked if the Stones would collaborate with the Beatles, Mick laughed, "Only if Ringo learns to keep time." So, when John Lennon suggested producing a record for the Stones in 1969, McCartney was livid. He slammed the demo on the table and asked, "Why waste time on those hedonists? Meetings between the two were always tense." Though Paul occasionally offered praise, his tone carried a hint of disdain. And perhaps that's why the Beatles-Stones rivalry never truly ended. If the Rolling Stones disgusted Paul McCartney with their debauchery and sloppy music, the next band angered him in a different way. 4. The Sex Pistols, a public brawl. If there was one genre Paul McCartney truly despised, it was punk rock, loud, raw, and dismissive of the rules he had built. At the center of that chaotic storm were the Sex Pistols, 4 brash, drug-addled youths ready to tear down the monuments of the previous generation. In 1976, when the Sex Pistols burst onto the scene with screeching guitars and provocative lyrics, McCartney was already irritated. "Their music is an assault on the ears," he reportedly said in anger. "It gives me a headache." But what truly enraged him wasn't just the music, it was the blatant disrespect from Johnny Rotten, the band's defiant frontman. Rotten made shocking statements calling McCartney a living corpse and a dinosaur past his time. This disrespect didn't stop at words. According to drummer Denny Sywell, the Sex Pistols used Beatles posters as target practice in their rehearsal space, riddling young Paul's face with plastic pellets from air guns. Paul tried to laugh it off, but that night he threw out every Beatles poster left in the studio, Denny recalled. "I'd never seen him that angry." Ironically, after the Sex Pistols disbanded in 1978, Rotten publicly trashed the band that made him famous, calling them a media joke and a manipulated band, blaming their manager, proving their chaos and disrespect weren't just aimed at McCartney but were the band's pathetic essence. The clash between rock generations peaked in early 1977 when Wings and the Sex Pistols were recording at AIR Studios in London simultaneously. The studio hallway that day was cramped thick with cigarette smoke, cheap booze, and sweat. McCartney emerged from Studio 2 holding a teacup, looking poised and elegant, the perfect image of a British legend. At the other end, Sid Vicious leaned against the wall, his leather jacket stained with beer, eyes bloodshot, chewing on a cigarette. When they faced each other, the air seemed to lose all oxygen. Paul Ever the Gentleman smiled and extended his hand. Sid stared at it, smirked, then spat on the floor, muttering in a hoarse, drunken voice, "Sell out of the establishment. Who do you old Beatles think you are?" As Sid lunged forward, McCartney's face hardened. Steve Jones, the Pistols' guitarist, threw a beer bottle at the wall, yelling, "We don't need your aristocratic rock." Studio security intervened, pulling the groups apart. Days later, the incident spread across London media, dubbed the Beatles versus Punk clash. But most fans never knew that one more word, and Paul McCartney might have taken a punch from 19-year-old rebel Sid Vicious, whom he later described in 3 words: crude, pitiful, and empty. Years later, when asked about it, McCartney reluctantly said punk brought music back to its raw energy. But when the reporter pressed, "What about the Sex Pistols?" Paul paused, pursed his lips, and added coldly, "They were a bunch of lunatics." His glare was so intense, the interviewer quickly changed the subject. However, what the Sex Pistols never understood was they could never end a legend. Their attacks and chaos only made Paul McCartney colder, sharper, and more ruthless in his artistic path. If the Sex Pistols disgusted Paul McCartney with their chaos and stupidity, another band kept him awake at night. Unlike Rebels, this band struck at his deepest fear, the fear of being surpassed. 5. The Monkees, a plastic version molded by moguls. In the 1960s, amid Beatlemania, a new band emerged, the Monkees. They had their own show, chart-topping hits and screaming fans rivaling the Beatles. But to Paul McCartney, it wasn't success. They're not a band, he once said with contempt. They're a plastic version crafted by moguls. McCartney despised the Monkees not just for mimicking the Beatles' sound. What infuriated him was that they were born in a boardroom, not on a stage. While the Beatles played 8 hours a night in Hamburg's grimy bars, sleeping on rat-infested floors, climbing to the top with blood, sweat, and tears. The Monkees were handed fame on a silver platter. Paul bitterly remarked in a private interview, "We traded our youth to stand on stage. They just had to read lines." What truly enraged McCartney was when the Monkees began copying the psychedelic style the Beatles created in Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Vibrant colors, visual effects, surreal lyrics. Even album covers all mirrored the Beatles like a distorted reflection. George Harrison recalled Paul snapping in the studio, "They're stealing our blueprint, and the world thinks it's creative." The tension peaked in 1968 at a Los Angeles party. Paul met Mickey Dolenz, the Monkees' lead singer. When Dolenz tried to chat, Paul paused for a few seconds, set his drink down, gave a cold smile, and walked away. Dolenz later said, "I don't think he ever saw us as real musicians. His look, it was like I'd insulted something sacred." Even when the Monkees later rebelled, writing and playing their own music, McCartney's view never changed. To him, they never achieved anything authentically, they were just trying to fix a reputation written by others. In a 2011 interview, when asked if his opinion had softened, McCartney smiled faintly. Their melodies were catchy, but they're definitely not the Beatles. That polite smile masked a contempt that never faded. To McCartney, the Monkees were neither colleagues nor rivals, they were a product of the entertainment industry created to exploit Beatlemania like a commodity. If the Beatles birthed the soul of pop music, the Monkees, in Paul's eyes, were thieves who stole that soul and sold it in a plastic box for thousands of dollars. And then, when Paul thought he'd grown used to copycats and boardroom bands, another shock hit, this time not from Beatles imitators, but from those who dared to surpass them on the charts with an unparalleled work ethic. 6. The Bee Gees. Sloppy, unprofessional, and a betrayal of music. In the late 1970s, Paul McCartney's empire began to waver. The Beatles had disbanded, classic rock was fading, and a new foe dominated the music scene, disco. Leading the charge were the Gibb brothers with their soaring falsettos and record-breaking Saturday Night Fever. Hits like Stayin' Alive and Night Fever catapulted the Bee Gees to the throne of global pop. But to McCartney, it wasn't creativity. "They're just Beatles light," he once sneered. 3 chords of falsetto and the world calls it art. What a joke. According to Wings guitarist Lawrence Juber, McCartney often heard the Bee Gees on the radio and scoffed, "Those 3 chords again. They just play faster than us and call it a new style. Do they think I'm blind?" But the laughter didn't last. When the Bee Gees began breaking records, the Beatles had set, Paul's irritation turned to genuine bitterness. The global success of Saturday Night Fever dominated the charts, McCartney once ruled. To Paul, the Bee Gees were disappointingly unprofessional. They didn't feel like artists who lived for music, but like producers of quick, flashy, consumable products. While the Beatles spent hours perfecting every detail, the Bee Gees often entered the studio unprepared. They wrote lyrics and recorded simultaneously, argued over clothes and hairstyles, and even abandoned sessions for lack of inspiration. A sound engineer recalled days when they recorded off-key but approved it anyway. The next day, the song topped the charts. Paul saw this as an insult to the craft. He believed the Bee Gees turned music into an assembly line using catchy pop formulas and flashy disco beats to make quick money. To him, they didn't create, they repackaged what the Beatles had done, lacking soul depth and respect for the art. Even as the Bee Gees were later hailed as disco legends to Paul, they remained copycats who got rich off others' sounds. The tension peaked in 1979 when both artists were recording in Miami. A studio engineer recalled, Paul knew the Bee Gees were in the next room. He said nothing, just coldly told his manager to reschedule everything. He didn't want to see them. Another time when the engineer mentioned the Bee Gees breaking a Beatles record, Paul stopped, clenched his jaw, and narrowed his eyes. Even when Maurice Gibb died in 2003, McCartney didn't attend the funeral. He was a talented man. The Bee Gees' music will be remembered. He mentioned no friendship legacy or emotion, as if speaking of a stranger. A Guardian reporter once wrote, McCartney could forgive Mick Jagger's laugh at Noel Gallagher, but with the Bee Gees, he could never laugh. And perhaps deep down, the Bee Gees dealt the sweetest blow, no rebellion, no defiance, just turning the Beatles' greatness into a formula for fame. To Paul McCartney, that wasn't success. It was betrayal. Paul McCartney didn't just hate a few bands, he despised an entire culture that stripped music of its soul. What you see before you is merely the PR stunts of the media. Over his 6-decade career, Paul McCartney once joked that the music world is like a beast. The very people who called him an icon or legend were the ones tearing music apart into a cunning business. Paul once said, the thing he feared most wasn't the noise of the stage, but the whispers of the media backstage, where music was twisted into an advertising tool and human emotions were replaced by viral content. In private interviews, he was blunt. What people see isn't music anymore. It's marketing remixed into sound. In the Beatles era, music was a living flame, each melody born from sleepless nights, sweat, and the struggle between ideals and reality. But as time passed, Paul saw the industry swap art for commerce. Real music was buried under layers of PR stunts, meticulously staged campaigns, and calculated emotional moments. At a late 1980s Los Angeles press conference, when asked about the rock revival, Paul smirked, "Revival, no, it never died. The labels just know how to make it look revived." He witnessed firsthand how music was programmed. What was once born from the soul was now shaped by Excel spreadsheets where revenue views and shares dictated artistic value. Paul recalled a time he overheard a young band discussing marketing strategies before composition. They debated outfits, logos, hashtags, then sound. He sat silently, then said softly, "I thought music started with a feeling. Now it starts with a campaign." The more he saw, the more he felt like a stranger in the world he helped create. The media never left Paul alone. They dug into every detail, and when Linda McCartney died, some outlets coldly accused him of exploiting grief to sell memorial records. The worst came after John Lennon's death. Paul's brief, "It's a drag," was taken out of context, said in complete shock, yet the media turned it into proof of a callous friend. For years, Paul lived with being misunderstood and hunted. He once likened the British music press to vultures waiting for someone to fall so they could tear them apart. Paul was a barefoot musician, no fancy studios, no effects, just instruments and passion. So watching young artists rise with auto-tune image and scandal felt like the collapse of real music. When a reporter asked what he thought of new stars, Paul replied, "I don't listen to them. I can't. What's there to hear?" In an old diary he wrote, "Music used to express the soul. Now it's perfume ads." McCartney lost faith in the music world around him. He realized he wasn't just surrounded by jealous rivals, but by a system that fed itself by killing art. The Beatles' success made Paul the most scrutinized member. He once confided, "I've spent half my life proving I'm not the Beatles' shadow, but people always pull me back there." In the end, Paul McCartney remained a lonely figure in his own glory. Colleagues said that after recording, he'd linger in the studio for hours. When asked why, he said, "I'm waiting for John's voice. It's still echoing somewhere." When the Beatles disbanded in 1970, Paul thought he'd escaped the whirlwind of fame. But he soon realized the industry didn't need music, it needed news. He bitterly said during Band on the Run sessions, "No one listens to what we're playing. They just want to know who I'm fighting with." Over 80, Paul still tours. But to him, music is no longer a race. It's a battle to preserve the soul of a bygone era. He told biographer Barry Miles bluntly, "Nowadays, artists don't need to be good. They just need to show up at the right time, wear the right clothes, and say what the audience wants to hear." This whole industry is a giant theater, and music is just a prop. To Paul, that world is a perfectly staged nightmare. Songs that once made the world tremble with their truth are now remixed into soulless tunes for ads, platforms, and views. He called it music's silent death, when everything is loud but lacks soul. Many in the industry call Paul McCartney grumpy or old-fashioned, but the truth is he's more heartbroken than angry. He once sat in Abbey Road's old studio looking through the glass where the Beatles played Hey Jude and told an assistant, "Back then we wrote music to say what we felt. Now they write to know what'll go viral." And perhaps in that moment he realized the bitterest truth of his career. What killed music wasn't forgetting it. It was that people still listened, but no longer truly heard. Paul didn't hate music. He hated the world that turned music into a commodity. And the bitterest truth was, no matter how many bands he despised or colleagues he scorned, what Paul hated most was that his era was over. An era where music was written with blood, sleepless nights, and heart. In the end, after all the glory, camera smiles, and millions of cheers, Paul McCartney remains a solitary man amid the ashes of the legend he created. He watched music transform from faith, emotion, and sincerity into numbers, campaigns, and commerce. He lived long enough to see self-proclaimed heirs trample the Beatles' legacy without understanding the pain and passion that built it. To Paul, music was never a race. It was a way for people to say what words couldn't, a language of the soul, of memory, of love and loss. But when the world began listening with ears instead of hearts, he knew his era had passed. Now in his 80s, Paul still stands on stage singing "Let It Be," but his eyes carry a deep nostalgia, as if singing for a world that's gone, a world where music was real. People see a legend, but he feels like the last survivor of a faded era. Paul McCartney isn't just fighting age, but the shadow of his own legacy. And perhaps in quiet nights when old melodies softly play, he still wonders, is anyone truly listening? Or are they just chasing the memory of a world that once knew how to love music?